Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A Christmas feast arranged, a deadly secret poured into every glass. 12 guests seated, yet only one survived the night's sinister plot. Clocks stopped, candles burned low, and whispers of betrayal filled the room. But before we begin, can you guess who walked away from death? It was a bitter December evening, the sort of night when London's fog thickened into a grey wall that muffled both sound and sight. The gas lamps glowed faintly in the murk, and the clip-clop of horses' hooves seemed far away, as though the city itself had sunk beneath a shroud of ghostly silence. In Baker Street, the fire burned bright and crackling, and my friend Sherlock Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown, sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, a violin resting idle against his knee. He had been in one of his darker moods for days, bored, restless, and intolerant of anything that did not engage the full force of his mind. I was about to suggest a walk through Hyde Park, purely to lift his spirits, when a sharp knock resounded through the sitting-room door. "Mrs." Hudson's voice, anxious and hurried, announced, "Inspector Lestrade, sir. He says it's urgent." Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden vitality. "Ah! Salvation from ennui, Watson," he murmured, springing to his feet. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson, quickly." Lestrade entered, his face pale and pinched from the cold, his moustache heavy with frost. He stamped his boots and nodded to me before turning toward Holmes. "I'd not come at this hour, Mr. Holmes, unless it were a matter of the gravest sort. We've got a situation in Mayfair, quite the Christmas horror." Holmes motioned toward the chair opposite him. "Pray sit down, Lestrade. You look as though you've walked through half of Scotland Yard to get here. Now, what has happened in Mayfair?" Lestrade drew a folded telegram from his pocket and placed it on the table. Sir Reginald Farringdon, retired, diplomat, well known in political circles. He held a Christmas Eve party last night at his townhouse on Wycliffe Street. This morning, every soul in the house was found dead. I felt a chill run down my spine. Dead? Good heavens, how many? 12, Lestrade said grimly. Guests, servants, even Sir Reginald himself. No marks of violence, no signs of struggle, every one of them seated at the dining table as though frozen mid-toast. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Fascinating. And you are certain there were no traces of poison?" "None that our medical examiner could find," said Lestrade. "No odor, no residue in the glasses or food. It's as if they simply stopped breathing." Holmes turned away, pacing before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. A sealed environment. A closed room. A dozen simultaneous deaths with no visible cause. He smiled faintly. "You are quite right to come to me, Lestrade. The affair promises to be unique." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "I'll be frank, Holmes. The commissioner's already muttering about some new sort of gas leak or foreign toxin. But there's something about the whole scene. It's too deliberate, too neat, almost like a stage play." Holmes stopped pacing. "Who discovered the bodies?" "A footman. He had been sent out early to fetch the morning papers. When he returned, the house was silent. He found them all sitting round the table, candles burnt to stubs, a few cracked wine glasses, and not a sound in the place." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And the footman himself? Is he still alive?" "Yes," said Lestrade, though half out of his mind with shock. Holmes nodded slowly. "Excellent. Then, Watson, we shall call upon Sir Reginald's residence immediately. There's nothing like the smell of mystery to warm one against a December night." He turned to fetch his coat and deerstalker. The old sparkle had returned to his grey eyes, the keen excitement of the hunt. "Come, my dear fellow. The game, as they say, is afoot, and this time, it seems, even Christmas dinner was fatal." And I made our way to Wycliffe Street. The fog had grown so dense that even the gas lamps hung like dim halos in the gloom, and the sound of the horses' hooves was swallowed by the mist. Holmes sat forward, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp eyes unfocused yet alive with thought. Lestrade, opposite him, rubbed his gloved hands together for warmth, occasionally glancing toward Holmes as though waiting for a pronouncement. But Holmes remained silent until the carriage jolted to a halt before the great iron gates of Sir Reginald Farrington's residence. The house loomed out of the fog like a mausoleum, its windows black, the wreath on the heavy oak door dusted with frost. Policemen stood guard at the gate, their breath visible in the frigid air. Inside, the warmth of the gas lamps only served to make the scene more macabre. The long dining table stretched across the room, glittering with crystal and silver, a grotesque parody of festivity. Around it sat 12 figures, frozen in eerie repose, as if the merriment had been stilled by an unseen hand. Holmes moved with silent precision, his gaze sweeping across the table. He paused before Sir Reginald, whose fine dinner jacket and white cravat were unruffled. The man's eyes were open, his expression calm, too calm. Holmes leaned in, his magnifying lens glinting in the lamplight. "No cyanosis of the lips," he murmured. "No muscular contraction. Whatever stopped their hearts did so without warning." He shifted his attention to the wine glasses. Each had been drained, but one, a delicate crystal goblet before a woman of about 30, elegantly dressed, her hand resting lightly upon her lap. Holmes inspected the glass, tilting it toward the light. "Not a drop spilled," he said, quietly. "Even in death, she appears composed. Remarkable." Lestrade cleared his throat nervously. "The doctors found nothing, no poison, no trace of gas. We even had the windows tested for leaks." "Nothing, Holmes. Not a thing." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "A mystery that leaves no residue is often one of intent rather than mechanism, Lestrade. Tell me, who was seated where?" Lestrade handed him a small notebook. "We've identified them all. Sir Reginald at the head, his sister Lady Penelope at his right, a Colonel Davenport opposite her, the rest friends and colleagues. The woman with the untouched glass, Miss Clara Mortlake, his secretary." Holmes's brow furrowed. "The only one who did not drink. Curious. You are certain she is dead?" "Quite," Lestrade replied. The physician confirmed it. Holmes paced around the table, his sharp gaze darting from one detail to another, the angle of a chair, the burn of a candle, the faint dusting of ash upon the carpet. He stopped suddenly near the fireplace. A single log smoldered faintly in the grate, though the air bore no scent of smoke. Holmes crouched, examining the hearth. "Watson," he said, "observe. The ashes here are not from wood, but from something finer, powdered paper, perhaps parchment. Someone burned a document shortly before the tragedy. I knelt beside him. A letter, perhaps. Or a list," Holmes said softly. "A guest list, revised." Before I could inquire further, he rose and crossed to a cabinet near the door. The drawers were locked, but a faint smear of wax near the keyhole caught his attention. "Sealed, then reopened," he murmured, and hurriedly resealed. He tapped it with his fingertip. "Lestrade, I must insist no one disturbs this until I return with proper instruments. There is method here, deliberate, meticulous. Someone has staged a tableau, not a massacre." Lestrade blinked. "Staged? But they're dead, man." "Precisely," said Holmes, his eyes narrowing. "And yet every death conforms to symmetry, each posture deliberate, each expression serene. This was no accident, Inspector. It was theatre." He turned toward the staircase, the shadows playing across his angular face. "Watson, fetch your bag. We shall examine the bodies for subcutaneous punctures or abrasions invisible to the naked eye. And Lestrade find the footman who discovered them. I would very much like to hear how a man can enter a house full of corpses and yet live to tell of it." As Holmes ascended the stairs, his voice echoed through the silence. "Someone performed an execution dressed as a celebration. The question, gentlemen, is whether the performance has ended or whether the final act is yet to come. The footman, a pale and trembling youth named Henry Bligh, was brought before us in the dimly lit drawing-room. He clutched his cap in both hands, his eyes darting between Holmes, Lestrade, and myself, as though unsure whether he stood before his saviors or judges. Holmes regarded him with that curious stillness which so often unnerved his subjects far more than any interrogation could. "You were the one who discovered the bodies," Holmes said quietly. "Tell me everything, from the moment you left the house until the moment you returned." "Sir Reginald sent me out about 10:30 to fetch the late edition of the Times. I remember it clearly. He'd just poured another glass of port. The others were laughing, singing carols. There was a piano playing. Miss Mortlake was the one playing, sir." Holmes nodded slightly. "And when you returned?" "It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes later. I opened the front door, and the house was silent. No music, no voices. I called out, but no one answered. I thought maybe they'd gone to bed, though that didn't seem right. What with all the lights still burning. I went into the dining room." He stopped, gripping his cap tighter. "They were all there, sir, just like you saw them. I thought they was asleep till I saw Sir Reginald's eyes." Holmes watched him keenly. "Was the door locked when you left?" "No, sir. I left it on the latch." "And you noticed nothing unusual upon returning? No smell? No draught? No stranger leaving the premises?" "Nothing, sir. Only the silence. It was, well, it didn't feel natural, if you understand." "I do," Holmes said, almost kindly. "And Miss Mortlake, the secretary, had you noticed anything peculiar about her that evening?" The boy frowned, thinking. She was quieter than usual, kept looking toward Sir Reginald as if she wanted to speak, but didn't dare. "She was fond of him, sir. Everyone knew it. But he treated her like a servant, not a lady." Holmes' expression darkened slightly, though his tone remained calm. "Did Sir Reginald appear well that evening? No sign of distress or agitation?" "None, sir. He was cheerful, proud of the party. Said it was his farewell to diplomacy, whatever that meant." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Farewell indeed," he murmured. "Thank you, Henry. That will be all for now. Keep yourself available. You may prove most useful before the night is done." When the footman had been led out, Holmes walked to the window, his hands clasped behind him. The frost on the panes glimmered in the lamplight, and the fog outside pressed against the glass like some silent intruder. "Watson," he said suddenly, "does anything in this house strike you as odd beyond the obvious horror, of course?" I considered the question. "It is unnaturally silent. There's not even the ticking of a clock." "Precisely." Holmes turned sharply, eyes gleaming. "Every clock in this house has stopped. Observe." He crossed the room and pointed to the mantelpiece. 10:45. The same hour, I assure you, as on the hall, clock below, and the small one upon Sir Reginald's writing desk, all arrested within the same minute. Curious, is it not? Lestrade frowned. Could it not simply be coincidence? Coincidence is the refuge of fools, Inspector. No, someone stopped them deliberately, and at the same precise moment. The symbolism is too perfect, the last tick before the end. He moved toward the door, his energy suddenly renewed. "Come, Watson. We must see Sir Reginald's study. A man does not host a farewell feast without reason. If I am correct, the motive lies not in the dining room, but in the papers he sought to destroy." The study was on the first floor, a large, oak-paneled chamber lined with books and maps. Holmes went directly to the hearth, sifting through the ashes with delicate precision. "Yes," he murmured, "as I suspected. Burnt vellum, and not ordinary stationery. Diplomatic correspondence, heavy parchment, embossed seal. And here, he held up a fragment with the faint impression of a crown and a foreign crest. Watson, this is no private matter. This is the seal of the Austrian legation." Lestrade stepped back in alarm. "Good Lord, you think this has to do with politics?" Holmes' lips curved into a thin smile. "Everything in London has to do with politics, my dear Lestrade. But this is personal treachery disguised as patriotism. Someone silenced a diplomat, and his guests under the guise of a celebration. The only question remaining." He glanced toward the ceiling, as though listening to a sound only he could hear. is whether the 13th seat at the table was meant for the murderer or for the next victim. Holmes stood motionless for several moments, the faintest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The fire in the grate crackled softly, the only sound in the dimly lit study. He crouched once more, examining the charred parchment between his fingers. Note the edges. Watson singed but not consumed. Someone burned this hastily, perhaps interrupted before the task was complete. See the wax residue on the hearthstone? It was sealed only hours before the fire. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. But why burn it, Holmes, and at such a gathering? Because, Holmes replied, his eyes glittering. It was the reason for the gathering. Tell me, Lestrade, do you imagine Sir Reginald to have been a sentimental man? The inspector shook his head. No. Cold, formal sort, by all accounts. Then it is hardly likely he'd host a Christmas party simply to toast the season. No, this was an affair of necessity, disguised as festivity. The wine, the laughter, the merriment, all to conceal a meeting of purpose. A farewell indeed, but not of the sentimental kind. He rose swiftly, scanning the bookshelves. With a sudden motion, he pulled a heavy volume of diplomatic treaties from the shelf. The book fell open easily, revealing a hollowed interior. Inside lay a small vial, stoppered and half empty. Holmes held it to the light, and I saw at once the faint shimmer of oily residue along its rim. Watson, he said, our mystery deepens. Smell this. I hesitated but obeyed. A faint metallic tang struck my senses, sharp, acrid, but strangely floral. It reminds me, I said slowly, of chloroform, but finer somehow. Indeed, chloroform's subtler cousin, chloral hydrate, perhaps adulterated with something less merciful. A sedative, not a killer, which raises the question, why should 12 people, none drugged, die together while the instrument of stupor lies unused? He turned the vial over in his gloved hand. Unless, of course, this was the wrong weapon. Lestrade frowned. Wrong weapon? Precisely. Whoever devised this tragedy intended to lull, not to slay. But someone altered the design. Someone transformed sleep into death. Holmes' voice lowered to a whisper. And that, my friends, is the true crime. He crossed to Sir Reginald's desk, examining the leather surface with his lens. Watson, observe the scratches here. See how the pen nib has cut deep into the leather. A man's hand trembles only under extreme duress. Our diplomat was not merely writing, he was warning. He brushed away the thin layer of dust to reveal a faint indentation, as though someone had scrawled upon a sheet above and torn it away. Producing a sheet of tissue and a small vial from his pocket, Holmes dusted the area lightly. Gradually, words began to appear in ghostly relief. Do not drink. Betrayal at the table. C.M. C.M. Lestrade read aloud. Clara Mortlake? Precisely, said Holmes. The secretary. She wrote this moments before the toast. She understood what was happening, yet she drank nothing herself. And now she, too, lies dead. He paused. Unless, of course, that was the intent all along to make us believe she died. A silence fell between us, broken only by the faint ticking of Holmes' pocket watch. You think she's alive? I asked quietly. I think, Holmes said, that no physician on this earth can certify a death he never questioned. Lestrade, were you present when her body was examined? The inspector hesitated. No, Dr. Melrose did the inspection before I arrived. He's competent enough. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Competent, yes, but unimaginative. A pulse may be stilled, a breath suppressed. There are compounds that mimic death for hours. If Miss Mortlake had both the knowledge and the motive, perhaps even the formula, we may yet find our 13th guest. Before we could reply, footsteps echoed faintly from the hall. A constable appeared in the doorway, his face white as paper. Beg pardon, sir, he said, addressing Lestrade, but one of the bodies, it's gone. Holmes turned sharply. Gone. Yes, sir. The woman, Miss Mortlake. We left her in the drawing room. She's not there now. Her chair's empty. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes's face broke into a grim smile. Watson, he said softly. The performance continues. He snatched his hat and coat, his movements brisk with excitement. Lestrade, double the watch outside. No one enters or leaves. If our phantom secretary still breathes, she has unfinished business and I intend to learn with whom. As we hurried down the stair, Holmes's voice was low and certain. A table set for 12, a host who spoke of farewells, a secretary who warned too late. We are no longer dealing with a single murder, my dear Watson. We are attending the final act of a conspiracy. We moved swiftly through the silent corridors of the Farringdon house, the faint echo of our footsteps following like an unwanted shadow. Holmes's lantern beam danced over the panelled walls as he led us down a narrow passage that ran behind the main staircase. Observe, Watson, he murmured. This corridor is not on the architect's plans. See the uneven plasterwork, the irregular cornice. A later addition. And such additions exist for one reason alone: secrecy. The passage ended at a low door, half concealed by a faded tapestry. Holmes crouched, running his fingers lightly over the handle. Dust displaced, hinges oiled. Someone has used this recently. He drew a slender knife from his pocket, slipped it into the keyhole, and with a soft click, the latch released. The door swung inward, revealing a steep stairway descending into darkness. Lestrade hesitated. Basement? Wine cellar, most likely, Holmes replied. Or something pretending to be one. Keep your revolver ready, Watson. We descended in single file, the air growing colder and more pungent with each step. The lantern's glow revealed rows of wine racks, but amid the bottles, something gleamed faintly. Holmes stooped and retrieved a small silver locket lying upon the stone floor. It bore the initials C.M. Clara Mortlake, I whispered. Indeed, Holmes said, and recently dropped. There are damp smudges upon the floor, mud from a woman's shoe. She came this way. Alive. Lestrade gave a low whistle. Then she's hiding down here? Or waiting for us, Holmes said quietly. Watson, to the right. What do you make of that iron door? It was half hidden behind stacked crates. Holmes brushed aside the cobwebs and pressed his ear against the metal. For a moment there was silence, then a faint rustle, the sound of movement. Holmes straightened. She's inside. Lestrade stepped forward, hand on his revolver. Shall I break it open? Holmes shook his head. No need. Miss Mortlake is far too intelligent to have locked herself away without means of escape. Stand back. He rapped sharply on the door. Miss Mortlake, you have staged quite the drama. It would be a pity to let it end without your final speech. A long pause followed. Then, slowly, a bolt scraped from within, and the door creaked open. In the lantern light stood Clara Mortlake, pale but very much alive. Her gown was torn, her face drawn, but her eyes, those grey, steady eyes, held neither fear nor surprise. Mr. Holmes, she said calmly. I expected you sooner. Holmes inclined his head. Then you anticipated that I would see through your death? I hoped you would, she answered. It was the only way to survive. Lestrade burst out. Survive what, woman? You've caused half of London to lose its senses. 12 people dead, murdered at your table. Her composure faltered. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Not by my will. I tried to stop it. Sir Reginald would not listen. Explain, Holmes said gently. She drew a shaky breath. Sir Reginald had been selling state documents, reports from Vienna, codes, diplomatic ciphers. I discovered it by chance when transcribing his correspondence. I confronted him. He swore he'd make it. Right that he'd summon those involved and end the matter quietly before word reached the Foreign Office. That was the purpose of last night's gathering. But one of the guests, he had other plans. Who? Holmes asked. She looked away. Colonel Davenport. He had arranged the sale of a final packet to a foreign agent. When Sir Reginald confronted him, Davenport laughed and poured the wine himself. I saw him add something to the decanter. I wrote the warning, "Do not drink," but no one saw it in time. I dared not cry out. They would have killed me too. "And how did you escape?" Holmes asked. I feigned to drink. The draught made them all collapse within moments, gas, perhaps, disguised in the wine vapors. Davenport thought me dead. I heard him leave through that passage, taking something from Sir Reginald's study. When I woke, the air was foul, and they were gone. I hid here until I heard voices upstairs. Holmes regarded her steadily. Davenport, then, fled with whatever document Sir Reginald burned in part the Austrian letter. He has a head start, but not for long. Lestrade clenched his fists. We'll have the ports watched every exit from London. Holmes nodded absently, his mind already racing ahead. Miss Mortlake, you have done both foolishly and bravely. You've survived an assassin's table, and in so doing, may have saved your country. He turned toward the stairway. Watson, bring her up. We have a murderer to catch before the night thaws, and I suspect he won't be difficult to find. Davenport's kind seldom run far from the scent of profit. As we climbed from the cold cellar into the pallid dawn, the first light of Christmas morning touched the frosted windows above. Holmes glanced once toward the gray horizon and murmured, "It seems, Watson, that even the holiest night can hide the blackest treachery." By the time we emerged from the Farringdon house, dawn had begun to break a thin, wintry light that did little to dispel the fog still clinging to London's cobbled streets. The constables stood stamping their boots for warmth, their breath rising in white clouds as Lestrade barked hurried orders. Holmes, however, appeared indifferent to both cold and chaos. His mind, I could tell, was elsewhere, already chasing Davenport through the labyrinthine alleys of his reasoning. "Lestrade," he said briskly, "have your men check every cab that departed Mayfair between 11 and midnight." Davenport would not risk walking far. His temperament is impatient, his conscience shallow. A man like that flees fast but not far. Lestrade nodded and moved off to relay the orders. Holmes turned to me, his gray eyes bright with calculation. "Watson, what do we know of Colonel Davenport?" I recalled the name from military circles. Decorated soldier, served in India, later attached to the War Office. Retired under ambiguous circumstances, something about misused funds, if memory serves. "Exactly," Holmes said, "a man familiar with both discipline and deceit. He would be clever enough to feign loyalty while selling secrets under his host's nose. Yet greed is a predictable vice, it leaves footprints everywhere." He beckoned me toward a nearby hansom cab. "Come, Watson. We shall begin where Davenport would think himself safest, his club." Within half an hour, we arrived at the Argonaut, an exclusive establishment tucked off Pall Mall. The doorman, half asleep and wrapped in a greatcoat, started when Holmes flashed his card. "Mr. Holmes, sir. Colonel Davenport was here earlier, just before midnight. He left in some haste." Holmes' expression sharpened. "In haste, indeed. Did he leave alone?" "Yes, sir. He ordered a carriage for Victoria Station. Looked agitated. I remember, because he tipped me with foreign coin, Austrian, I believe." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "The scent grows stronger. Watson. The Austrian connection. Again, this is no petty smuggling affair, but a diplomatic theft." He turned back to the man. "How long ago did he depart?" "Near 6 hours now, sir." Holmes stepped into the fog, his coat billowing around him. "Then we have but little time. If he reaches the continent, England loses more than one traitor, we lose proof." The hansom cab clattered toward Victoria, wheels slicing through the icy slush. Holmes sat rigid, silent save for the low hum of concentration that seemed to vibrate through him. When he finally spoke, it was with the precision of a marksman taking aim. "You recall, Watson, the half-burnt parchment bearing the Austrian crest. Yes, it was an agreement of transfer, a cipher key for decoding dispatches between London and Vienna. With it, an enemy could read every secret communiqué our government sends. Farringdon and Davenport plotted its sale, but Farringdon's conscience, belated as it was, intervened. He tried to end the deal, hence the farewell dinner. Davenport, cornered, acted ruthlessly. The wine was his weapon, the party, his smokescreen. I shuddered, and Miss Mortlake, an innocent drawn into the game, nearly paid with her life. Indeed, Holmes said softly, though one might argue her intelligence saved her and us. As we reached the station, the shrill cry of the whistle cut through the morning air. A train stood ready to depart, its steam hissing like a serpent in the pale light. Holmes leapt from the cab before it stopped, darting through the throng with astonishing swiftness. I followed, barely keeping pace. "There!" Holmes called, pointing toward a man near the rear carriage, a tall figure in a dark overcoat, a valise clutched tightly in his gloved hand. Davenport, his face, pale beneath his moustache, betrayed the panic of a man cornered by fate itself. He turned, saw Holmes, and bolted down the platform. "Stop him!" Lestrade's men, having arrived moments behind us, gave chase. Davenport vaulted a luggage cart and dashed toward the outer tracks, but Holmes was faster. With a sudden burst of speed, he caught the colonel by the arm just as the whistle screamed again. The valise flew from Davenport's grasp, striking the ground with a metallic thud. "Enough, Colonel," Holmes said coldly, his grip iron. "You've run your course. The final station awaits." Davenport struggled, but exhaustion overcame him. The constables seized him, and Lestrade snapped the cuffs on with grim satisfaction. Holmes bent to retrieve the fallen valise. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay the very parchment whose ashes we had seen intact, save for a torn edge. Back in the cab, as the first snow began to fall, Holmes regarded the document thoughtfully. Strange, is it not, Watson? A dozen lives extinguished for a few lines of code, and yet, in this city, such things are deemed ordinary. I watched him in silence, the wind howling softly beyond the window. "Will Miss Mortlake be charged?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No. She is guilty only of devotion to truth, and perhaps to a man unworthy of it. Let her rest. I have no doubt her conscience is punishment enough." He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. "Lestrade will take his credit, as is his habit. The newspapers will speak of treason thwarted and justice served. But between us, Watson, we know the truth. It was not reason that saved these shores tonight, but compassion, a rarer virtue than deduction." The cab turned into Baker Street as dawn ripened to day. Holmes stirred, his voice distant but firm. "And now, my dear fellow, let us have breakfast. The world is safe for another Christmas morning, though I confess, I find peace far more elusive than crime." It was late afternoon when we returned to Baker Street, the sun already veiled behind a haze of winter cloud. The lamps along Marylebone Road flickered to life, and a light snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, muting the rattle of passing carriages. Inside our familiar sitting room, Mrs. Hudson had kindled a welcoming fire, and the scent of tea and toast brought a comforting warmth after the long, bitter night. Yet Holmes, for all the domestic calm, paced before the hearth with that peculiar intensity which marked the aftermath of a case unresolved in his mind. I seated myself near the fire, grateful for the heat, and watched him in silence until he suddenly stopped short and turned toward me. "Watson, what troubles me most in this affair is not Davenport's villainy, but his precision. He executed his crime with military efficiency, and yet, one small element eludes me." I looked up from my cup. "You mean the motive beyond money?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "Davenport could have fled long before the dinner. He need not have risked exposure by poisoning a table of witnesses. Why stay? Why kill 12 souls instead of vanishing quietly into the continent with his prize?" I pondered this. Perhaps he feared betrayal. Farringdon might have spoken to the authorities. Holmes shook his head impatiently. No, no. Fear alone does not explain such theatricality. He wanted the act itself, the symmetry, the finality. A farewell dinner turned funeral feast. There is psychology here, Watson, not practicality. He resumed his pacing, smoke curling from the pipe clamped between his teeth. Consider. The clocks all stopped at 10:45. A ritual gesture. The poison, if poison it can be called, rendered its victims lifeless, yet peaceful, without a trace. Even the setting, the candles burnt low, the wine untouched by violence, Davenport sought to make death itself orderly. Why? Perhaps, I ventured, because he fancied himself judge and executioner. Holmes stopped again, his eyes half closed. Executioner? Yes, but for what crime? Before I could reply, Lestrade burst into the room, stamping snow from his boots. His face was flushed with excitement. Holmes! We've had word from the yard. Davenport's made a full confession. He admits to the killings, says he acted alone. Holmes regarded him coolly. A confession is merely words, Inspector. What precisely did he say? Lestrade opened his notebook. Claims Farringdon was selling military codes to Vienna for years. Says the guilt finally drove him to confess over dinner. Davenport insists he merely ensured silence, says the others were complicit or knew too much. Holmes' lips curled faintly. Ah, the dying villain's narrative so convenient, so incomplete. Did he explain how he administered a fatal agent, leaving no trace? He said it was gas released from a flask concealed beneath the table. Holmes's brows rose. Nonsense. I examined the room myself. No residue, no mechanism. Davenport may be guilty of murder, but not of invention. Someone else perfected the method. Lestrade frowned. Someone else? Yes, Inspector, and I suspect she has already vanished. Realization dawned slowly on me. You mean Clara Mortlake? Holmes nodded gravely. Indeed, she had both motive and opportunity. She knew of the documents, handled the correspondence, and possessed the scientific knowledge to prepare the compound. The supposed warning she left, "Do not drink," was a ruse, designed to absolve her in advance. She feigned death to ensure Davenport took the blame. A perfect inversion of guilt. Lestrade's eyes widened, but she seemed terrified. Acting, my dear Lestrade. A performance worthy of the theater. Remember, she alone refused the wine. She alone escaped. Even her locket, conveniently dropped in the cellar, was a breadcrumb left for me to follow. I have been led, Watson deliberately. He strode to the window, staring into the drifting snow. She's clever. Unimaginably so. She used Davenport's greed as her weapon and his confession as her escape. By morning, she'll be beyond our reach. Lestrade sputtered in disbelief. But we can wire every port, every ship. Holmes turned slowly, the faintest trace of melancholy in his voice. It will do no good. A woman like Clara Mortlake could vanish in plain sight. She may already be halfway to Vienna, with the cipher key in her possession. A long silence followed. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the bells of Street Mary's tolled the evening hour. Holmes stood unmoving, his face unreadable. At least, I said at last, justice was done for the 12 who perished. Holmes glanced at me, a distant sadness in his eyes. Justice, Watson, is rarely so tidy. A murderer may hang, and yet the true architect of evil walks free. We call it closure, but it is only ignorance wearing a mask. He turned back to the fire, drawing his dressing gown close. Still, I confess the case has a curious symmetry, 13 at a table, and only one survives. Perhaps that was the design all along. The perfect illusion. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. A Christmas miracle of sorts. The firelight flickered across his sharp features, and for a moment the room fell utterly silent. Outside, The snow continued to fall over London, soft, relentless, and as indifferent as truth itself. For several days after the affair of the Farringdon dinner, Holmes withdrew into one of his characteristic silences. He neither spoke of the case nor engaged in any new work. The newspapers had christened it the Christmas Massacre of Mayfair, filling columns with speculative rubbish about secret societies and foreign assassins. Lestrade, basking in the unearned glory of Davenport's confession, was hailed as the savior of the empire. Yet I knew well that Holmes regarded the entire matter as unresolved, the melody unfinished, the final chord still hanging in the air. He sat for hours by the fire, the morning papers spread around him, his pipe sending up slow spirals of smoke. "Watson," he said one grey morning, without lifting his gaze, "does it not strike you as strange that Miss Mortlake's disappearance has raised so little curiosity? The Yard accepts her account, yet no official record of her departure from London exists. No passage booked, no lodgings vacated, no trace in the registries of travel." "Perhaps she went under another name," I offered. Holmes nodded absently. "Undoubtedly. But to what end? She has her freedom. Davenport will hang, and yet the very item that could make her fortune, the cipher, has not resurfaced. No nation, no broker, no buyer has made inquiry. My instinct tells me she has not sold it. She has hidden it. Because concealment is the surest form of confession. Only those who know themselves guilty must disappear so completely." Just then, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes broke the seal and read aloud, "From Vienna. Immediate attention required regarding document bearing Austrian crest. Details confidential. Urgent diplomatic matter. M." He rose at once, his entire demeanor transforming from languor to precision. "Watson, pack your bag. The game resumes." Within 12 hours we were aboard a night train speeding through the Channel fog toward the continent. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels accompanied our silence. Holmes sat opposite me, head bowed, eyes half closed, yet I knew his mind raced faster than the locomotive itself. "Vienna, Watson," he murmured finally, "where our secretary might hope to vanish among the embassies and operatives. A city of masks, where loyalty and treachery share the same uniform." By the time we arrived 2 days later, snow blanketed the grand boulevards, and the city glowed with festive lights. Yet, beneath the gaiety, Holmes moved with purpose, consulting old acquaintances in the consulate and tracing whispers among the cafes frequented by diplomats and spies. On the third evening, his persistence bore fruit. "She's here," he said quietly, as we left a narrow alley near the Kärntnerstrasse, registered under the name Clara Merlini in a modest boarding house near the opera. "She has been corresponding with a man known to our Austrian friends as the broker, a dealer in secrets, notorious for arranging sales too delicate for governments to acknowledge." "And you believe she intends to sell the cipher now?" Holmes gave a slow nod. "Or to trade it for protection? Either way, the curtain will rise tonight." We waited until darkness fell, watching from across the street as the boarding house lights flickered. Near midnight, a cloaked figure emerged, slender, graceful, unmistakable even beneath the hood. Clara Mortlake, or rather Merlini, moved quickly through the snow-laden street, glancing behind her with the wariness of the hunted. She turned into a small cafe, whose windows glowed faintly gold. Holmes and I followed silently. Inside, the warmth and scent of coffee mingled with the low murmur of patrons. At a corner table sat a man in a dark coat, his gloved hand resting on a leather portfolio. Clara approached him, her voice low but urgent. Holmes leaned toward me. "Observe her posture, controlled but fearful. She means to bargain, not betray." Moments later, she produced a folded parchment from her sleeve, the cipher, unmistakable even from our distance. The man extended his hand, but before he could touch it, Holmes was upon them, swift and silent as a hawk. "Madam," he said softly, "this performance has gone on long enough." Clara froze, her eyes wide with shock. The broker leapt to his feet, but Holmes fixed him with a gaze so cold and steady that the man faltered, muttered something in German, and fled into the night. Holmes turned back to her, his voice calm. "You could have sold this 100 times over. Yet here you sit, risking your life to trade it now. Why?" She stared at him, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Because I couldn't live with it. I never meant for them to die, Mr. Holmes. I only wanted to frighten them, to stop them. But the gas, it was stronger than I realized." Her voice broke. "I have been trying to return it, to end it." Holmes regarded her quietly for a long moment. "Then end it you shall." He took the parchment gently from her trembling hands and folded it into his coat. "Go home, Miss Mortlake, or whatever home remains to you. There is no bounty on redemption, but it is the rarest prize of all." Outside, the snow fell heavily now, softening the city's edges. Holmes stood beneath a lamp, the faint yellow light gilding his profile. "Watson," he said at last, "there is your answer. Evil, when born of conscience, is still evil, but it carries the seed of grace. Perhaps that is why I can never quite despise it." As we walked away through the sleeping streets of Vienna, I glanced back once. Clara Mortlake was gone, swallowed by the falling snow, one more ghost in a world too full of secrets. The following morning dawned clear and cold over Vienna, the snowfall from the night before lying thick across the rooftops like unbroken ivory. I awoke in our modest hotel room to find Holmes already dressed, standing by the window with the morning paper folded neatly in his hand. The pale winter sunlight caught the sharp outline of his face, revealing an expression neither triumphant nor weary, but something altogether more pensive. "The matter is finished, Watson," he said without turning. "The cipher has been delivered into safe hands. Our Austrian hosts are effusive in their gratitude, though I suspect their motives are rather more self-preserving than noble." I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "And Miss Mortlake?" Holmes turned then, his eyes unreadable. "She has vanished again." The boarding-house proprietor found her room empty at dawn. Her belongings were left behind, save for a tepid, small photograph of Sir Reginald Farrington. "I rather think she has gone where no one will follow." I frowned. "But she might have stood trial. Holmes perhaps even won clemency." "You let her go." Holmes moved to the fire and stirred it absently with the poker. "My dear Watson, the law punishes crimes of passion and profit, but it has no measure for crimes of remorse. Clara Mortlake is already serving a sentence more severe than any court could impose. She will spend the rest of her life at war with her own conscience. What more could justice demand?" He placed the poker aside and seated himself opposite me, crossing one leg over the other. "Yet there is something in her that lingers in my mind, a curious blend of intellect and tragedy. You see, she loved Farrington, in her own restrained and hopeless fashion. His corruption was a wound to her pride, but his repentance, too late as it was, touched her heart. When he resolved to expose the scheme, she sought to protect him. The formula she created was meant only to render them unconscious, not to kill. A miscalculation of dosage, an excess of precision, those were her true accomplices. I said nothing for a moment. The tragedy of it pressed upon me like the weight of the snow outside. So much folly, so much guilt, born not of malice but of love. Holmes went on quietly. She fled the scene, believing she could correct what she had done, recover the cipher, prevent its sale. But guilt is a poor companion for logic, Watson. It drives one toward confession disguised as redemption. There was a pause, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. Then he looked at me sharply. "Tell me, my friend, do you think me cruel for letting her go free?" "Cruel? No," I said, earnestly. "I think you acted with compassion and with understanding that few others would possess." A faint smile touched his lips. "Compassion, Watson, is an uncomfortable cloak for me to wear. It chafes, but perhaps it is necessary, now and then, to remind oneself that beneath all our calculations, we are still human." He rose abruptly, as if shaking off sentiment. Come. The train leaves at noon. London awaits, and Lestrade will be insufferable if we allow him to parade his heroism much longer. The journey back was long and uneventful, the rhythm of the train a steady accompaniment to Holmes's introspection. He spoke little, though now and then he made brief notes in his pocketbook, his brow furrowed in thought. Only as we neared the Channel did he speak again. There is a peculiar poetry in this case, Watson. A Christmas feast turned requiem, a diplomat damned by conscience, a woman redeemed by guilt. It is not the sort of tale the world cares to hear, but it reveals more of human nature than a dozen common crimes. I nodded. And of you, Holmes. You saw beyond evidence to mercy. He gave a short laugh. Mercy, perhaps, but not absolution. Were Miss Mortlake to cross my path again in darker circumstances, I should do my duty. For now, I have chosen to let her ghost rest. We arrived in London beneath a sullen sky. Baker Street was much as we had left it, the same familiar clutter, the same fire burning low in the grate. Mrs. Hudson met us with relieved exclamations and hot tea, while outside the bells of street poles tolled faintly across the frostbitten air. Holmes stood at the window, watching the falling snow. Strange, is it not, Watson? He said softly. How the purest whiteness may conceal the darkest stains. Yet beneath it all, life endures. Even the wicked leave behind lessons worth studying. He turned back toward the fire, his face illuminated by its glow. I suppose, in the end, the true mystery is not why people commit evil, but how they live with it afterward. That, my dear fellow, is the one puzzle even I cannot fully solve. He sank into his armchair, eyes half closed, the faintest trace of melancholy in his voice. Now fetch your pen, Watson. There is a story here, and I should hate to think the world deprived of its final moral. And as I began to write, the fire crackled, the snow fell, and London seemed, for one brief evening, to hold its breath caught between sin and salvation, reason and grace, as if the city itself were listening to the tale of the Christmas party no one survived. The weeks that followed the events in Vienna passed with a peculiar quiet on Baker Street. London had returned to its ordinary rhythm, the newspapers having quickly exhausted their fascination with the Christmas tragedy, and Lestrade basked in the ephemeral glory of Davenport's conviction. Yet Holmes remained restless, pacing the sitting room for hours, alternately playing the violin and staring into the fire, his mind evidently still entwined in the web of the Farringdon affair. I had just returned from a routine morning call to the chemist when I found him hunched over a sheaf of notes, his eyes scanning the lines with an intensity that made my arrival almost imperceptible. Watson, he said at last, you may consider the case closed. Davenport arrested. Miss Mortlake vanished. The cipher secured, but the human elements of this affair are far from concluded. I raised my eyebrows. The puzzle is solved, Holmes. What remains to ponder? He straightened and lifted his sharp gaze to me. Curiosity, my dear fellow, how people respond to guilt, to fear, to the knowledge of complicity. Miss Mortlake, for example, her intellect could have taken her anywhere, yet she chose discretion and disappearance over glory or notoriety. It is a choice we rarely see in those capable of genius. I nodded, considering the young woman who had manipulated life and death with calm precision, and yet carried the weight of conscience as a cloak heavier than any winter coat. And Davenport? I ventured. Does he understand how narrowly he escaped being merely a pawn? Holmes shook his head. Slowly. Perhaps not. Greed and self-interest cloud the intellect. He will cling to the belief that cleverness alone ensured his rise. In truth, he was manipulated by circumstance and by Miss Mortlake's foresight, yet he pays the penalty for his overreach. Law, in this case, and consequence, are beautifully aligned. He paused, drawing a deep breath. What fascinates me, Watson, is the pattern of human behavior under pressure. The meticulous planning, the improvisations, the misdirection, all elements I would employ if I sought to understand the criminal mind. And in Miss Mortlake, I see an entire world contained, intellect, courage, and remorse intertwined. I watched him, noting the rare softness in his expression. It seems you have a certain admiration for her, Holmes. He smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Admiration, yes, but tempered by the awareness of her power. There is a danger in recognizing one's equal. And yet, in the end, I am content she has chosen her path. I respect that. It is a rare honesty in a world of pretense. Holmes settled back into his chair and tilted his head toward the ceiling. And now, Watson, we may turn our attention to less morally convoluted matters. Letters to answer, experiments to conduct, notes to review. Life continues, even when the human heart has been tested so thoroughly. I poured us both a cup of tea, observing the flicker of the firelight on his angular features. Do you ever feel the weight of these cases, Holmes? He chuckled softly. Weight is relative, my dear fellow. One must bear the burden of intellect lightly. To do otherwise invites fatigue, if not folly. The thrill lies in the pursuit, in the unraveling of complexity. The moral elements, though fascinating, are secondary to the logic that binds them. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note addressed to Holmes in a delicate, familiar hand. He broke the seal and read silently, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the lines. Well, Watson, he said at last, folding the paper with care. It appears that even when one puzzle is concluded, another waits patiently. A colleague in Paris requests consultation on a matter involving a missing heir and a series of encrypted letters. Shall we go? I smiled, anticipating the excitement to come. It seems there will be no rest for the consulting detective. Holmes rose, donning his coat and deerstalker with practiced ease. Rest is overrated, Watson. Adventure, observation, deduction, these are the sustenance of the mind. Come, the world awaits, and there are always mysteries in need of solution. We stepped into the brisk London air, the streets glistening from an early frost. Holmes walked with his usual brisk, purposeful stride, the long coat swaying behind him, eyes alert to the smallest movement, the faintest shadow. Remember, Watson, he said over his shoulder, a mystery is never truly over. It lives in the details, in the consequences, in the quiet corners of human conscience. And sometimes the most profound revelations are those that leave no one the wiser but ourselves. I followed, feeling the familiar thrill of anticipation that only accompanied the pursuit of truth with him. Behind us, the gas lamps flickered in the winter dawn, casting long shadows along Baker Street. The case of the Christmas party no one survived had ended, yet its lessons would linger, as would the memory of a remarkable woman who had played both player and pawn in a deadly game of wit, courage, and conscience. Holmes glanced once more at the quiet street, his expression inscrutable. Come, Watson, onward. There are always more stories to uncover, more enigmas to confront, and I, as ever, shall follow the trail wherever it leads. We walked on together into the waking city, the mystery behind us and the promise of the next case ahead, as London's fog slowly lifted to reveal the pale light of a winter morning.